Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Maasros Perikei Halacha Beis, and perhaps starting today Halacha Gimel. We're learning today Daf Mem Gimel. We left off on Daf Mem Beis, Amid Beis, 3 lines before the bottom of the Amid by the dot Hevia Pachos Mishlish. So first of all, on Daf Mem Beis, Amid Aleph, we had a Tosefta that quotes a machloikis between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, which is exactly the same topic that our Mishnah was discussing, but today we're going to follow through quoting Shitas Rabbi Akiva versus Shitas Chachamim, and that is that if you have a field in Surya that belonged to a non-Jew and its produce reached the Oines HaMaasros while still in the possession of the non-Jew, only after that was it purchased by a Yid. So Rabbi Akiva holds, since during this critical point it belonged to a goy, obviously that will always remain exempt from Maasros, but more than that, all that grows, even if you leave that product on the ground, attached to the ground, and it grows 2/3, roiv, none of it will have to be tithed, all of it is exempt, Shitas Rabbi Akiva, and the Chachamim, like Rabbi in our Mishnah, I just don't want to confuse people. The Chachamim and the Tosefta hold that no, true that whatever belonged to the goy, we're speaking about the shlish, or maybe even more, that will be exempt. But if a Jew bought that while still attached to the ground and left the product on the ground and it grew more, that addition, that Tosefes that grew under the ownership of a Jew, rabbinically, yes, has to be tithed. That is the machlokes that's going to lead us all the way to the Mishnah and Halacha Gimel today on Amud Beis. But before we begin, another thing that I want to review from yesterday. We had Rabbi Yoinason that teaches that we applied the same when it comes to the Shvi'is here, which means that if you have grain that attained 1/3 before Shvi'is, we will treat that grain as a product of the 6th year. None of the regulations of Shvi'is will apply to it, again, even though 2/3 grew on the Shvi'is year. Now, what we're going to begin to learn today, we have Rabbi Lazar. Actually, Rabbi Lazar, we still learned yesterday. Rabbi Lazar says that even the Chachamim who hold Tosefes Chayiv, which implies that the Oines HaMaasros is not that significant, it's still very significant. Even the Chachamim that say, again, regarding tithes, since that Tosefes Chayiv, so it's not like this is a product that belonged to a goy. No, what belonged to the goy belonged to the goy, and now the additional is viewed as it is in its current state. Nevertheless, even Chachamim are moida that when it comes to the determinant of what year is this produce from, and since that the critical point by grain is the shlish, if it reached a shlish in the 2nd year, all of it will have Meiser Sheni removed from it. We're not going to say that the shlish is Meiser Sheni, but the Tosefes is Meiser Ani. For that we don't do. If it reached a shlish during the 3rd or the 6th year in the Meiser Ani year, then even though it grew the roiv after, in the next year, it will be judged solely by the year in which it reached the shlish. And that was a very important nakuda that we said yesterday. In other words, that where do the Chachamim say Tosefes Chayiv only b'negeya dinei Maasros Chayiv or Prater, but not concerning the determinant of what year does it belong to. Now, what we're going to learn today is a couple of fascinating things. First of all, the Gemara is going to tell us that Rabbi Akiva will agree to the Chachamim that when it comes to other items that have another critical point, as an example, fruits, critical point is when they bud, chanata. That's the determinant to what year it belongs to. When it comes to legumes, we say it follows when it took root, which is shortly after it's planted. Hashrasha. Chanata and hashrasha happens way before a shlish. So the Gemara is going to say that even Rabbi Akiva, that when it came to the grain, says, if it reached a shlish under the ownership of a goy, all of it will be exempt. He will be moida that items that are that have their critical point at a way earlier stage, either chanata or even more back by the hashrasha, we won't say that since it reached that critical stage under the ownership of a goy, none of it will be chayiv. That happened too earlier on. Since basically the entire product grew under the ownership of a Jew, yes, it will be chayiv. The Gemara is also going to show how this machlekes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim is going to be used or applied even in an opposite scenario. In other words, Rabbi Akiva, who says when it comes to Maisris by Surya, if it attained the shlish under the ownership of a goy, all of it is exempt. We are going to apply the same principle, even in the opposite direction, as we will see when we learn. And the same thing with the Chachamim. So we're going to have a very strong consistency between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. This more or less, the final topic will be the topic whether we apply this to challah. So we're going to learn a little bit about the laws of challah. Now we know that the obligation of challah only kicks in when you mix the flour and the water. We also know, we live in Chutz La'aretz, that midrabanan you have to take challah also by grains that grow in Chutz La'aretz. Midoraisa, only grains that grow in Eretz Yisrael have to be tithed. And here the same question will happen. Midrabanan, let's go with that. What about grain that grew in Syria? And while it grew in Syria, it attained the shlish under the ownership of a goy. Then it was bought by a Jew. The Chachamim, as we said, when it comes to Maisris, hold Toisefes Chayiv. Will the Chachamim hold that the Toisefes that grew after the Jew bought it in Syria, that which grew post-sale, will that be Chayiv and Challah or not? Do we link these dinim or not, as we'll see in the Gemara? If we'll have time, we'll begin today Halacha Gimel. Halacha Gimel, which is also the final Mishnah in the entire Masechta. The first topic of the Mishnah will be Temed. Temed is a drink that has in it some of the flavor and the appearance of wine. So either they would take wine sediment, or they would take, or they would take wine grape seeds that already underwent its process. Wine was taken out from it, but now you have this sediment, this leftover. You would seep water in it, and the water would have this tint, this reddish look. It would have some sort of smell / flavor of wine. That was called temed. And we're going to question whether, at what point do we say that temed has to have maisres removed from it? And when do we say by temed that it's water? The fact that it has a little bit of flavor of wine, it doesn't change its definition as water. Water does not need to be tithed, so we'll leave it at that. Chevra, let's go to Daf Mem Beis, Amid Beis. We have to remember clear, the whole Daf today is referring back to the Tosefta, Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. The topic is about maisres, produce that grew in Syria under the ownership of a goy, and it attained the shlish under the ownership of a goy. Rabbi Akiva holds that even though a Jew buys it, none of that will be chayiv in maisres. All will be exempt, even though 2 shlishim grew under the ownership of a yid. And the Chachamim are the ones that hold that Tosefes is chayiv. Again, we said that Rabbi Yonasan tells you that the same applies to shvius. This is important. And now the Gemara says, let's keep on going. Via pachois mishlish lifnei shvius. If you have grain that didn't reach the shlish before the Shemitah year, right? So you can't say it's product of the 6th. Now we're going to go into that and see one. Maybe we could. The nichnasa shvius, and now this 7th year arrived. So first of all, the pshat, since it's not defined as product of the 6th. So this rabbinic prohibition, or we just learned yesterday, the biblical prohibition of svichim is going to take in effect. So then asurim mishum svichim. Okay, but now there's a lot that the Gemara, again, like the Yerushalmi, did not speak out, but almost like Iker Chasim in a Sefer. So as the Marafulda goes into another point, when do we say, my friends, that the shlish is that important? I'll tell you when. If the intent of the owner is to use this grain as food, which is normally the intent. And how would I know that, what his intent is? That he did not harvest it before it reached the 3rd. In the few circumstances where someone who knows what they're doing will harvest grain before they even reach the third, which halachically it's not called food. You know why they would do it? Because they need animal fodder, they need grass, and that's what they have. Or they're very wealthy, they have many other fields. They can afford, you can feed your animal steak. So if you harvested it after a third, that shows that for you, this is oichel. Therefore, the shlish is a critical point. Since it did not reach a shlish before Shvi'is, it reached the shlish on Shvi'is, then it's product of the 7th year. And all of the restrictions of produce of Shvi'is will go on this grain. But, nevertheless, listen to this. Now you have to add something. This veloy chala aleh, which is the last line, if you decided to harvest it before it reached the third, Alex, on the 7th year, you harvested it on the 7th year, but before it reached the third, if you harvested it before it reached the third, what are you showing? You're showing that for you, it's not oichel. If for you, it's not oichel, you cannot call it product of the 7th year. Why? Because why is the shlish that important? Only because as oichel, shlish is the critical point. V'loy chala aleh kedusha shvi'is. Imagine how many people needed to break their heads to figure that out. No, it's the words asura mishum svichim is in the case where you harvested it after it reached the third. V'loy chala aleh shvi'is must mean that if you harvested it before it reached the third, obviously you harvested it on shvi'is. If you harvested it in the 6th year, there's nothing to talk about. You harvested it before it reached the third. This shows that for you, it's not food. So who cares if it didn't reach a shlish before the 7th year? It's irrelevant. It began to grow in the 6th year. In all cases, if you harvest something, well, let me say like this. If the whole thing grew on the 7th year, it might be different. Here, it began to grow in the 6th year. The only reason why we're not considering it product of the 6th year is because it didn't reach a third.
If it begins growing here, and
it's more problematic, no doubt.
But the intent is still that it
doesn't matter. Unlike maisres that only come from human food, there is a there's a sanctity of shvi'is on everything that grows on the 7th year. So whatever the rules are, we learn Masechta Shvi'is. It's a product of the 7th year. Turning to Daf Mem Gimel. Why? Why is that? Because since you harvested it before it reached the third, that's the key, and it began to grow on the 6th. Daf Mem Gimel, exactly to what you're saying. Shekvar hoyu asavim, because it already had its beginning of growths in the 6th. Now, normally we say, it didn't reach a third. If the owner has decided that this will be grass, third is irrelevant. And therefore, v'loy chala aleim kedusha shvi'is. Look inside the top marafulda. Exactly, that's the way he understood Pshat in the Gemara. V'loy chala aleim kedusha shvi'is al ha'asavim ka'amar. That im liktum asavim, if he harvested them to be used as grass, then there's no kedusha shvi'is. Why? Because it began to grow in the 6th year. Because shu'asavim kvar hoyu kol gidoleim b'shishis. Even though you left it in the ground and it grew even more. So what? This is all going back to this concept. Let's go to Rabbi Akiva, that once it has a certain definition, like in the case of Maisris in Surya under a goy, then whatever that is remains on everything.
What's the term for the point at which the third growth?
What's your question?
What's the term for the point at which it is?
Once it reached the third, so then let's go from Maisris. If a person harvested it after that, it's going to have to be a tithe. If you harvested it before it reached the third, you never have to tithe it because it's not called human food. From Maisris, it's about human versus animal.
There is a point after which it's edible. We take it's has integrity as a food item.
Called oichel. Okay, let me go weiter. You're going to get the word in a moment. We got to go. Now, 1 second. Now let's apply the same thing in the opposite direction, which is from the 7th to the 8th. The beauty here is that sometimes when the Gemara does it, it's inconsistent. Makes it harder. This is consistent. If hevia pachus mishlish lifnei shminis, if it didn't reach a third, something began to grow spontaneously. Svichim. and either a seed was blown from the air, or because last year's harvest, when you uprooted it, you left the roots in the ground and they regenerated. However it works. So if I'm saying that because you're not allowed to plant on the 7th year, but still, even when people don't plant, things come out of the ground. So if it did not reach a third on the 7th year, that would be good. Not so simple. Not so simple. Now, not so simple. And it entered the 8th year, and you harvested it on the 8th year. So if you harvested on the 8th year, Alex, and on top of that, it didn't reach a third in the 7th year, so then muteres mishum svichim, period. But here again, but if on the 8th year you harvested it, these grains before they reached the third, what did you show with that? For you, it's not oichel. If for you it's not oichel, what is it? It's grass. When did the grass begin to grow? On the 7th year. Grass, even though it's animal food, is included in the sanctity of Shvi'is. So it will be included in the sanctity of Shvi'is. V'chalalem kedusha Shvi'is. Good. Want to try one more
Please
time?
remind us, Rabbi, is ספיחין של שביעית מותר במאכל בהמה?
No.
No.
That's the whole point. Shvi'is is different. We learned yesterday whether Svichim is Asur Doiraisa or Derabanan. The Torah says in Bahar, Eis Sviach Kitzircha, Eis Sviach Sodecha Loi Siksoir. The Torah says. But I think Rashi says it means don't, Svichim or not Svichim, don't harvest it Kederach HaKoitzrin. That's something else. That's the whole thing we learned to Masechta Shvi'is. It's not like you can't harvest anything on the 7th year. There's many restrictions. You can't harvest to store, you can harvest to eat. You can't harvest with utensils, you harvest manually. There are all those rules. Okay, right. Now, says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Today in Marin, look at these words. They both paskin. Or, add an aleph, today in Amarim, they both say, Moidim chachamim l'Rabbi Akiva. Wow. That what? Besidron shel shanim. This is exactly what we learned yesterday from Rabbi Lazar. Even though the Chachamim say concerning Maisres, Hatoy Sefes Chayiv over there in Surya, it sounds like the Chachamim don't add so much weight to the critical point of a third. Yes and no. They don't give it the same weight that Rabbi Akiva gives it, but it has tremendous significance for all of it, not only for that which grew. When it comes to determining what year does it belong to, that's called the determinant. Mamish, the same words of Rabbi Lazar, Besidran shel shanim. What year does it belong to? That if it reached the third in the 2nd year, then it grew 2/3 in the 3rd year, all of it will be tithed as Meiser Sheni. Shema Yesheni Sheni. If it reached the 3rd in the 3rd year, the year of Meiser Ani, even though the majority grew in the 4th year, Meiser Sheni year, Ani. In other words, even the Chachamim attach real significance to the Oinas HaMaisres, and it will determine the definition of all of it. They only argue when it comes to this tithing, Midrabanan and Surya, on top of that, to belong to a guy. In that case, limited over there, do we have a machlekes, Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim? You good?
Relative.
So go one more time, quickly.
Well, first, in this point, it seems like in the last camp where if the plant started growing in the 7th year and reached the
Third
in the 8th year,
yes,
that point has less significance because it is still considered to be.
No, that point only has less significance if you harvested it before it reached the 3rd. That's the key.
Only if you harvested it before.
That's right.
The 3rd and the 8th.
Even if it only was going to reach a 3rd in the 8th year, if on the 8th year you harvested it before the 3rd in the 8th year, then it's 7th year product. Then it's the 8th year product. So it's mamish consistent. Very good. Now, says the Gemara, let's go back to, Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Don't only limit Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim to Peiros, Surya, under Goy, later bought by a Jew. Let me broaden it at least a bit, which will be Hefker, right? Something is Hefker. something grew as hefker, or if something grew under the ownership of Hegdish, and the case that we were discussing, Surya, all of these three cases, in all of the cases, says Rabbi Yechanan, do we have the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim? So, as an example, a peiros Hegdish doesn't have to be tithed. Okay, so a peiros belong to Hegdish. While attached to the ground, someone redeemed the field from Hegdish, but they redeemed the field of Hegdish after the produce reached a third, Herst Werter, according to Rabbi Akiva, even though it grew 2/3 under the ownership of a private citizen, none of it will have to be tithed. Why? Because it belonged to Hegdish during Shlish. According to the Chachamim, they would also say, you're right, that third that belonged to Hegdish, while it hit a third, that third never will have to be tithed. But the other 2/3 will have to be tithed. And the same thing with Hefker. So again, the determinant of the year, I got it. We had Rabbi Lazar yesterday. Today we have Rabbi Yechanan, Reish Lakish, Moedim Chachamim LaRabbi Akiva. That we don't divide the product into two parts. It's one product. But on the other hand, their machlokes isn't only Peter Surya owned by a goy. We're broadening it. It also the same will apply to Hegdish. The same will apply to Hefker. Okay. Now, like we said in the intro, let's take this argument, and everyone will stay consistent with their opinion, even though the result will be the opposite of what we have in the Tosefta, which will be in this case. Amar Rab Shimon ben Lakish. Oh no, I got ahead of myself. Before that, Moidi Rabbi Akiva l'Chachamim. When it comes to fruits, the critical point of fruits is when they bud, and it's self-understood, guys. When Chanota, Tu B'Shvat, right? I'm already after Tu B'Shvat here in LA. Today we're Beis Nissen. What do you see of fruit on the trees? Nothing. A little nothing. It's not a third. Nevertheless, the determinant of the year is Chanota. When it comes to legumes or to the items that we say, not even when it budded, when it took root in the ground. 3 days after planting, 2 weeks after planting, it's really close to planting. Those items, you're not going to tell me that Rabbi Akiva is going to say, let's go back to Surya. Someone had an orchard in Surya, belonged to a goy. Goy had an orchard. And it reached Chanata when it belonged to a goy. And now a Jew buys it, attached to the ground. Now it blossomed. Now it's the end of summer. Now you're harvesting the fruits. We're not going to say, well, Rabbi Akiva holds, all is exempt. No. Because Mele, I get it. 1/3 and 2/3. 2/3 is the majority, but 1/3 is significant. It grew a third. The Chanata stage is a nothing stage. In this world, it's a little bud. The root, it just took root. Basically, all of it grew under the ownership of a Yid. Even the Rabbi Akiva will be moided that the Tosefes will be chayiv. And what's the Tosefes? Basically everything. Minus the seed. Maybe not even that. I don't even know if you minus the seed because it's nothing. It's not the fruit. Okay. Now, says the Gemara, I want to give you a rule that we never maybe spoke out yet. All of the obligations of tithing, of maasros, is only when that which grew in a field, excluding inside a home. In our halacha, the definition of a home is a roofed area. It's amazing. That means if you live in the Holy Land, and in your home, I'm not even talking about in a non-perforated pot. That's not even in the earth. I'm talking about in your home. If you go ahead, take off your floors, at some point you'll hit the earth here in LA. You have earth underneath it. And you planted something. And somehow there's enough. I heard marijuana, they grow in homes. Maybe they don't need sunlight. They grow it on the ground. You don't have to give maasros. Just give a warning. People will do it. Someone had his house blown up. It's dangerous. You don't have to mention names. They're being recorded. But anyways, coming back over here. So here what happened was like this. A guy had a churva. Churva means a destroyed home. In our context, the iked, what counts is not that the walls, it's not that it's old, it's that the roof was not there. So therefore, it had the halachic definition of a field. And the person, prior to fixing that home, decided to use the earth to plant something. Zara b'churva. It reached the level of shlish while it was in a churva. Churva is a place that demands maasros being taken from whatever grows in it. And at some point, you decided to fix your churva, meaning you covered it, you roofed it. V'sichech al gabav. And then it grew the other 2/3. So we're going to go consistent. So says the Gemara, al data de Rabbi Akiva. What did Rabbi Akiva say? That the third is the determinant. Now Rabbi Akiva applied it in our Tosefta, l'kula. Since it belonged to a guy, it's going to be exempt. Here we're going to apply it l'chumra. Same logic. Since the third, it reached the third when it was in a field in an unroofed area, even though you roofed it, even though 2/3, right, majority grew in the roofed area, doesn't matter. Al dati de Rabbi Akiva Tosefes chayiv. There he says spotted hair Tosefes chayiv. Same concept applied in the opposite direction. The shlish, even the Tosefes is chayiv. The first third for sure is chayiv. Everything is chayiv. But al daten de Rabbanan, even though the first third has to be tight because it's something that came in a churva, nevertheless the Tosefes is spot. In other words, they will, each one will stay loyal to their premise, even though the application is going in the opposite direction. In the Braisa, Rabbi Akiva will be the most lenient, and here Rabbi Akiva is going to be the most stringent. Now, in the opposite case will be like the case of the Tosefta, like the case of the Mishnah. You planted something babayis, and the hever mi al gabav, and at some point, after whatever you planted reached the third, the roof was blown off, the house became dilapidated. Now 2/3 grow in an area that halachically l'chu'ura have to be tithed. Al data de Rabbi Akiva, none of it has to be tithed. Why? Because we look at the shlish. When it was a shlish, it was babayis, product that grows in a house, and a roofed area don't have to be tithed. Hatisefes spotted. Al data de Rabbanan hatisefes chayv. In other words, this case is taka parallel to the case of the Braisa, parallel to the case of the Mishnah. The chiddush of the Gemara was in the opposite direction, zara b'churva, and vehivia shlish, and then v'sichech al gabov. Now, here comes the kasha. Well, how do we apply this to challah? Now, again, I know that challah chutz la'aretz is chayiv. We're going with challah's Eretz Yisrael is chayiv. First of all, midoy raisa, which is true. By the way, even nowadays, there's a machlekes whether challah in Eretz Yisrael is a biblical or a rabbinic obligation, but I don't want to get into it right now. We're going to have the Sechtas Challah. We'll speak about it a lot more then. Looking that, based on a certain phase in Jewish history, where grain that grows, those that are made from grain that grew outside Israel is exempt from having challah removed from it. Only challah Eretz Yisrael. During that time, when we conquered Syria, and we mentioned, and the Chachamim said that even though it's kibush yachid, items that grow in Syria have to be tithed, they also included challah in that. But that's only, again, that's the logic, if it belonged to a Jew. If it belonged to a goy, what are we learning? Nothing has to be tithed. If it belongs to a goy, challah doesn't have to be taken. So what were to happen in the same case? There was a grain field. It hit a third while it was under the ownership of a non-Jew, a Syrian. A Jew went ahead and a Jew bought it. Now it grew another 2/3. You harvested it. Now you made it into flour. You mixed the flour into the dough. Obviously, the chiyuv of challah is only when you make a dough out of it, when you mix the flour into water. Are we going to say that we have a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim, whether that is chayv b'challah? Like l'chayra, maybe l'Rabbi Akiva, no challah has to be taken off it. Why? Because it's all exempt. Same thing. Maybe only l'chachamim, the flour that came from the grain that grew post sale, that maybe that has to have challah removed. That's the Gemara's question. Should we say what I just spoke out? And the Gemara and Daf Mem Gimel Amid Beis says, no. Ma'at boy mi Rabbi Akiva. What do you think? What are you trying to say? That it's exempt? The Rabbi Akiva Omar. Rabbi Akiva said, and this is a befeidish Mishnah, in Masechtas Challah. Listen to this. Peiros chutz la'aretz, a product, grain, that grew outside Israel. Imagine. Not in Syria. It grew in LA. We're talking about Bisman. There was no chiyuv of challah. Rabbi Akiva says, when it comes to challah, yes, biblically it's about Israel. But it's not about what grew in Israel. It's about where did it become a dough. even paid us complete chutz la'aretz, shenichnasu la'aretz, and it was kneaded into a dough ba'aretz, look, it will be chayiv in chala mide oiraisa. Wow. So therefore, it's not related to this whole machlokes, a shlish, toisefes chayiv, not toisefes. It has nothing to do with that. Where was it kneaded into a dough? If it was kneaded into a dough in Eretz Yisrael, you're going to be chayiv. If it was not kneaded in Eretz Yisrael, then you're going to be pater. If we're speaking about a time, if there was a time that Surya on that level was like Eretz Yisrael, if it was kneaded into a dough in Surya, you're going to be chayiv. Even Rabbi Akiva, even though it belonged a third under the ownership of a guy. And the Gemara says, this is only Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Rabbi Akiva is the one that holds that when it comes to challah, even though it's about Israel grain versus chutz la'aretz, but it's not about where it grew, it's about where it was kneaded into a dough. But not everyone agrees with Rabbi Akiva. I yisbar Rabbi Akiva ke Rabbi Eliezer. Then if we would not hold, that means if Rabbi Akiva would hold like Rabbi Eliezer, means that if we would not follow Shitas Rabbi Akiva, even though the question is L'shitas Rabbi Akiva, what's according to Rabbi Eliezer that says it has to do where the grain grew. According to this Rabbi Akiva that says that if it reached a third under the ownership of a goy, none of it will have to be tithed. If I put these two things together, this is a theoretical question, then I have a leg to stand on by asking the question. Then perhaps, according to this sheet of Rabbi Akiva, it will not have to have challah removed from it, and only lechachamim will the dough that came from the grain that grew post-sale will have to have challah removed from it. Be'emes, Rabbi Akiva is not going to argue with himself. Rabbi Akiva holds it's irrelevant. But if Rabbi Akiva would have argued with Rabbi Eliezer, then I think I would have this inquiry, and perhaps indeed we will apply the same machlokes of the Tosefta to this case as well.
Theoretical question, the Gemara needs to
Hmm?
This theoretical question, the Gemara doesn't answer.
That's correct, because it sounds like taka will be that way. I think we do apply it. Now, Rabbi Bun Bar Chia asked in front of Rab Ze'era. Let's go to the next case. We have this again. We're familiar with these halachas. Many people plant in flower pots, in ceramic pots. And halachically, we differentiate between a flower pot that has a perforation, right? A perforation big enough that Rambam says for one root to go through it. On top of that, probably it has to be within a certain height from the ground, even though a root did not go through it. Halachically, it's considered attached to the ground. We're not talking about that. We're talking about someone who planted whatever, ba'atzitz she'eino nakav. They planted it in a flower plot that's not perforated, which means whatever grows from there is exempt from Isris. Let's go further. And it reached the level of a third. And, what was that?
Non-perforated and elevated.
Doesn't have to be elevated. No, the opposite. It has to be perforated and low.
It has to be perforated.
And low for it to be considered attached. So let's speak about a flower pot. People have it today. It's laying on the ground, but it's not perforated. You have a big vase, big. You're planting a tree in it, but it's on the ground. It's not perforated. It reached a third, and then it cracked. Then now there is a hole. Now v'nikev. Same question. Do we say that since it reached the third while it was exempt, all of it remains exempt or not? Is this? So Amalei, to which Rab Ze'era responded that Achshav Nikev. Achshav Nikev means that since it only got a hole right now, which is after it reached the third, I want you to know that Rab Ze'era paskins like Rabbi Akiva. Based on the ruling of Rabbi Akiva, none of it will be chayiv. Mamish, like the case of Surya, all is exempt. In other words, he compares this case to the case of Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. He paskins like Rabbi Akiva. Okay, finished. And that's perhaps a way that the Yerushalmi is telling us to paskin like Rabbi Akiva. Perhaps. It's like they brought a shaila, and he paskined, and that psak din is based on Rabbi Akiva, so it's like the Yerushalmi is ruling like Rabbi Akiva. Now we just have to clean up or clarify the two last parts in the Mishnah. If you remember, we had a very unusual Mishnah. Why is it very unusual? Because we had the Tanakama. The Tanakama in the Mishnah was the one that said, like Rabbi Akiva, that all is exempt. That was the Tanakama in our Mishnah. We didn't have a name. All is exempt. Then we had Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. What did Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel say? Shimon ben Gamliel had a certain leniency. He said that in order for there to be the exemption, that what counts isn't only who owns the produce, it's also who owns the land. When a Jew buys the produce, let's say if he buys the produce before it reached the third, right? Before it reached the third, then it'll be chayiv, right? The Jew, that's what the Mishnah says. Rabbi Gamliel says it's not enough for a Jew to buy the produce attached. He has to buy the produce and the land. He had that thing. In other words, he holds that if a Jew doesn't own both the produce and the land, then he won't be chayiv. Then the Mishnah wrote to Rabbi. Rabbi doesn't go on Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi goes back to the Reisha. Rabbi says that I disagree with you who says that if it reached Oynas HaMaisris while it belonged to a goy, all is exempt. Rabbi says, like the Chachamim just said in the Tosefta, he says, no, that third is exempt, but the other 2/3 will be chayiv. So it's like Tanakama, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and Rabbi. They're not debating with each other. It's not a three-way machloikis. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is making one observation regarding one din of this, who owns it. How do you define the ownership? It's not enough for a Jew to own the produce, he has to own the land. Rabbi was speaking about the effect of the shlish. So first of all, the Gemara says, Amar Rab Oven, says Rab Oven, Asya, the Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, this Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who demands for a Jew also to own the land, he also, this follows, Bishitas Rabban Gamliel Zekenoi. The Gra writes Rabbi Gamliel Aviv, just for the record. There was Rab Shimon ben Gamliel. That means his father was Rabban Gamliel, just to know which Rabban Gamliel, we'll call him Rabban Gamliel of Yavne. Rabban Gamliel of Yavne's Zayde was Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. Now, many times when you read in the Mishnah, Rabban Gamliel, you have to know who's who. The problem here is that since we have two versions, so we don't even know who's who, but at least we are aware that we don't know who is who. So what the Gemara is saying is that our Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, that demands not only for the Jew to own the produce, but to own the land, that follows either the Girsa is Rabban Gamliel, his father, which would mean Rab Gamliel of Yavne. The way we have the Girsa, Rabban Gamliel Zekenoi, it's his great-grandfather. But that's what it means. Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. Which Rabban Gamliel? Okay, whichever, the father or the father Zayda. The Tanin on Taman we learned in Masechtas Chalon. Yisrael shahoyu arisim l'goyim b'Surya. If a Jew was a sharecropper in Surya, sharecropper by default means that he owns a percent, and whatever he takes is viewed always to be owned by him, but he doesn't own the land. So Rabbi Eliezer says mechayev pereseim l'maisers. The part that the Aris takes is chayiv. Why? Because it belonged to a Yid. Rabban Gamliel pointed. Why? Because Rabban Gamliel holds that when is Peiroi Surya chayiv in Maisres, not only if the Jew owned the Peiros, the Jew has to own the land. And even if you're going to apply Breira to an Aris, the land he does not own. So that's aligned. And now Rebbe Yomer, when Rebbe says Lefi Cheshbain is what we had in the Tosefta, the Chachamim saying Tosefes Chayiv. Lefi Cheshbain means, Rebbe says, what's exempt? Yeah, the third that belonged to the goy. By the way, could be you bought it when it reached half. The half that belonged, that's exempt. But whatever else grew while a Jew owned it, that's the meaning of Lefi Cheshbain. So what the Gemara wants to clarify is that the Rebbe that came in our Mishnah after Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is not commenting on Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rebbe is al Roisha. Rebbe is going back to the Tanakama. Rebbe and the Tanakama argue concerning what we call today Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and the Tanakama argue regarding something else. Jew owned land, Jew owned in Surya's chayiv. What is the definition of Jew owned? According to the Tanakama, Jew owns the produce. According to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Jew owned means the produce and the land. Two different arguments. Rabbi put them together, and the Gemara clarifies who exactly is arguing with who. And Baruch Hashem, we have time, so we can even say that we are beginning to make the siyum meaning that we are learning now the last Mishnah. We're not going to have time today to finish. It's a big Mishnah. It's a Gavaldik Mishnah. Many different topics. But the first topic of this final Mishnah, Masechtas Maasros, final Mishnah also in Perek Chamishi, is about Temed. And again, Temed is some sort of inferior wine. If we are to judge Temed as water, sweetened water, wined water, then Temed will be exempt from Maasros as water is exempt from Maasros. The moment we're going to determine that this Temed, Dinoi, Kiyayin, it will be Chayev in Maasros and maybe even Doiraisa. So how do we do that? So how Misa made? Now, they would either prepare it, okay, you're soaking water either in wine sediment or just in grape seed. Doesn't make a difference. You soak the water. Now, let me begin with the following. Let's say you have a jug. The jug is filled with this wine sediment. A jug, a liter. You add into it a liter of water. So in other words, you have a keli that has 2 liters, 1 liter wine sediment. You filled it up with another liter of water. You let it sit. It seeped. I don't know how long they needed to do it. And then they poured the water out. Now the water is reddish. The water has an aroma. The water has a taste. If the amount of water that you removed was equal to the water that you put in, I know what you might be thinking, Rabbi Yehuda will think. So don't worry if you have a kasha. You might have a great question. But what the Chachamim hold is that we say all you got from the wine sediment was flavor and taste. You didn't get substance. You didn't get actual wine. What's my proof? I poured in a liter of water. How much water did I get out? A liter. I didn't get something from the wine sediment. We just learned in the previous Mishnah that right wine sediment, oil. If you squeeze wine out of it, you have to tithe it. You take kernels out of straw, but you didn't get anything out of it. So that's what the you put water and you know how much you put in. So I'm giving an example. The midah is a liter, whatever the midah is. And then after, if it has to seep for 24 hours or for a week, I don't know how the process works. But whenever you decided, okay, it's done, you remove the water and now you have the same amount. Fact that the volume of the liquid did not increase, I'm going to therefore say that you know what went into the water? The flavor, not the substance of the wine sediment, and therefore it's water. And water doesn't have to be tithed, potter. Says Rabbi Yehuda, what are you talking about? Let me tell you the other way of looking at it. I have a liter of sediment. Yeah, Dan. I put a liter of water. You know what might have happened, which probably happened? Some of the juice of the wine sediment went into the water that I have now. But if some of it went in, then I should have more than a liter. No, because the water that I put in went into the wine sediment. Now, I want to say, Bichlal, in the times of Chazal, wine was very concentrated. We all know this. And they needed to water it down. What is the correct ratio of water to wine? So we also had that. Some people would put 2 parts water, 1 part wine. Some people would put 3 parts water, 1 point wine. Forget about Temed. What happens if a person put, 20 parts water and 1 part wine? That also will not be chayiv. Will not be chayiv in Maasros. It's not Temed, but because it's water. So without getting into how much wine is needed, Rabbi Yehuda says generally, just because you gave in a liter and you got out a liter, it doesn't mean that you got out what you put in. You put in water. Part of what you got out was what was in the wine sediment, and it's enough for you to be chayiv. Rabbi Yehuda is mechayiv, gevaldik. Now, okay. So first of all, we're gonna jump into that and more in the Gemara about we're gonna see. He's gonna consider it 1 part wine and 2 parts water. He's gonna say that that's what happened. A lot of wine sediment went into it. Okay. Now, lokula alma, according to everyone. The first case was you put in a liter, you got out a liter. What happens if matzah yoiser al midasoi, turning to daf mem dalid? This is so important. You know what you don't say? You don't say now that you got more than what you put in, so now there's wine, so all of it is wine. It's temed. Temed is not wine. Temed is watered down wine. What part of it has to be tithed? Moitzi olav b'makom achad lefi cheshbon. The Meiser's obligation is not by the total volume of the temet. I put in a liter. I got out a liter 1.1. The 0.1 has to be tithed. And you don't take it from here because here is a mixture. So you have other wines that's not yet tithed. And when you make your cheshbon of how much you're giving, Truma Meiseres, you also give it and by Truma min Hamukov, by Meiseres Sholei min Hamukov. But all you need to give is Lefi cheshbon and not for the total volume of Temet. That's the rule of Temet. And we're going to get back to that into the Gemara. But before